Most people believe peace comes from escaping pain, from solving it quickly, distracting themselves, or simply pretending it isn't there. But what if that instinct, the urge to run, is the very thing that keeps the pain alive? It's a strange truth most of us discover only after years of exhaustion. The more we push certain feelings away, grief, rejection, disappointment, the more quietly persistent they become. Like a shadow that grows longer the faster we walk. Maybe you felt it too. A moment of criticism that lingers in your chest long after the conversation ends. A memory that appears out of nowhere on a quiet evening. Or that subtle heaviness that follows you even on days when everything seems fine. Most people respond the same way. They fill the silence with noise. They keep moving, scrolling, planning, worrying, anything to avoid sitting with the feeling itself. And yet, there's a quiet paradox many wise people eventually discover. Peace doesn't arrive when pain disappears. It appears when we stop fighting what is already here. In this story, you'll meet a man who spent years running from a quiet weight inside him. Until one day, beside a simple stone resting in a basin of water, he encountered a lesson that changed everything. Not a complicated philosophy, not a dramatic transformation, just a gentle shift in how he met his own pain. And once he learned that secret, something surprising happened. The storm inside him didn't need to be defeated anymore. It simply began to pass. Elias had grown used to running from discomfort, not with his legs exactly, but with his attention. Whenever a heavy feeling stirred in his chest, he'd reach for something: noise, distraction, a hurried thought about tomorrow, anything to avoid sitting with that quiet ache. After all, who would willingly linger with pain? He often told himself it was just common sense. Pain, after all, was something to fix, escape, or bury under busyness. Stay with it too long and surely it would swallow you whole. At least that's what his mind insisted late at night. So he kept moving inside his own thoughts, shuffling emotional furniture around. Yet strangely, nothing ever seemed to leave the room. There were evenings when exhaustion settled into his shoulders like a damp coat. He would sit by the window, watching the streetlights blink awake one by one. And despite a day filled with activity, a quiet weight still lingered. It followed him through conversations, through laughter, even through sleep. Running, he was beginning to notice, required an awful lot of energy. At times it showed up in ordinary moments. A careless remark from a coworker that echoed longer than it should, a memory of someone who once mattered deeply, or that subtle sting when a message went unanswered. Small things, perhaps, but they carried a stubborn gravity. Whenever the feeling rose, Elias would push it down quickly. He'd tighten his jaw, straighten his posture, and think, not now. He believed that if he paused too long with the ache, it might grow unbearable. Better to outrun it before it took shape. Better not to look directly at it at all. Still, the strange thing about avoided feelings is how patient they are. They wait quietly in the corners of the heart, like a shadow that stretches longer the faster someone walks away from it. Elias had begun to notice that no matter where he went, the shadow arrived first, and it never seemed tired of following. Some nights he wondered, only briefly, before dismissing the thought. What if the exhaustion didn't come from the pain itself? What if it came from the endless effort of pushing it away? It was a troubling idea, so he rarely let it linger. But the question had begun whispering nonetheless, and somewhere beneath all the rushing and resisting, another quieter thought stirred. What if peace wasn't hiding far away at all? What if it had been waiting patiently inside the very place he kept avoiding? The possibility felt unsettling, almost absurd. Yet, as fate would have it, Elias was about to encounter someone who lived by that very truth. The following morning carried the same quiet heaviness Elias had grown familiar with. He walked through the town square with his usual quick pace, as if the air itself were chasing him. Inside his chest, that same restless pressure stirred again. Not sharp, not loud, just steady, like a knock on a door he refused to open. And as usual, his first instinct was to ignore it. Elias had spent years believing pain was an enemy, something to outsmart, outrun, or outwork. If sadness appeared, he drowned it in noise. If shame surfaced, he buried it under distraction. Yet oddly enough, the harder he resisted these feelings, the heavier they seemed to become. It was almost as if the pain wasn't asking to be defeated at all. It simply lingered, waiting with an odd kind of patience, like a letter sitting unopened on a table. The message inside didn't shout, didn't demand, but it refused to disappear. That day, while passing the edge of the square, Elias noticed something unusual. A small stone basin stood beside a quiet path lined with trees. Inside it rested a single smooth stone, dark and round, as though worn by years of water. For reasons he couldn't explain, the sight of it made him pause. And pausing, well, that was something he rarely allowed himself to do. He leaned closer and touched the stone. Cool, steady, unmoving. Unlike his thoughts, it seemed perfectly at ease, simply being there. No effort to escape the basin. No struggle to become something else. A strange realization brushed his mind. Perhaps peace wasn't about removing what felt heavy. Perhaps it had something to do with how one held it. After all, the stone hadn't vanished, but somehow the basin still looked calm. Water gathered around it without resistance. Elias frowned softly at the thought. He had spent years piling suffering on top of pain, resentment, fear, endless analysis. What if the pain itself wasn't the true weight? What if resistance had been the real burden all along? It was a quiet, unsettling idea. And as he stood there beside the basin, the morning breeze passing through the trees, he felt something shift ever so slightly. Not relief exactly, more like the faint loosening of a knot. A possibility that peace might begin not with escape, but with the simple courage to remain. Of course, Elias didn't yet know how to do that. In fact, the thought of facing his own grief directly still frightened him deeply. There were memories he kept locked away for a reason. Losses he believed might break him if he looked too closely. And those buried wounds were about to surface sooner than he expected. Not long after that quiet morning in the square, the weight Elias carried began to reveal its shape. It wasn't just a vague heaviness anymore. There was a story behind it. A few, actually, woven from moments he rarely allowed himself to revisit. Loss had brushed his life more than once, and not always gently. And somewhere along the way he'd learned the habit of pretending he was fine. Years earlier, someone he loved had walked out of his life without warning. No dramatic goodbye, no clear explanation, just absence. At first Elias tried to understand it, replaying conversations late into the night. But eventually he stopped asking questions and started avoiding the memories altogether. It felt safer that way, or so he thought. Still, certain things had a way of reopening the old ache. A familiar song drifting from a cafe. The sight of two friends laughing easily together. Even the quiet hum of evening, when the world slowed down enough for thoughts to wander. That's when the heaviness would return most strongly. When it did, Elias reacted the only way he knew. He kept busy. He scrolled endlessly through his phone, turned on music, or found small tasks that didn't really matter. Anything to avoid sitting still long enough to feel the truth rising beneath the surface. Silence to him had become dangerous territory. Yet the more he ran, the more his emotions gathered behind him. Like water pressing against a dam built in haste. He could feel it sometimes, during a sharp moment of criticism from a colleague, or when someone's careless words stirred a sudden flash of defensiveness. His reactions came quickly, almost automatically. Deep down, Elias feared something he rarely admitted, even to himself. He feared that if he ever truly faced the pain, it might break him open. That grief might rush through him like a storm with no end in sight. So he kept the doors closed, the windows shut tight. Better to hold everything together, no matter the effort. And yet, holding everything together had become exhausting. There were mornings when his chest felt tight before the day even began. Moments when his patience wore thin over the smallest inconveniences. Not because he was an angry person. No, not really. But because his heart was tired from carrying what it had never fully faced. The stone basin in the square had started appearing in his thoughts unexpectedly. That quiet image of the still water and unmoving stone lingered in his mind. Sometimes, while walking past it, he'd pause for just a second longer than before, not quite ready to understand why it mattered, but sensing faintly that it had something to teach him. What Elias didn't realize yet was that someone nearby had already noticed his quiet pauses. An older man often sat on the bench beside the basin, watching the wind stir the leaves. He never seemed hurried, never distracted, and on one particular afternoon, their paths were about to cross in a way Elias couldn't have planned. By the following afternoon, Elias found himself drawn back to the quiet path again. He didn't quite know why. Perhaps it was the calm of the trees, or the way the world seemed to slow down near the basin. Or maybe, though he wouldn't have said it aloud, it was that smooth, dark stone resting quietly in the water. Something about it felt oddly familiar. The stone sat at the center of the basin, half submerged. Water gathered around it without complaint, forming gentle ripples whenever the wind passed. It didn't fight the water, didn't try to escape it. It simply remained there, steady and silent. And the more Elias looked at it, the more it reminded him of something inside himself. For years he had tried to pretend his own inner stone didn't exist. The grief, the shame, the lingering disappointment, he had wrapped them tightly beneath layers of distraction, like covering a wound with too many bandages, hoping no one would notice what lay underneath. But the strange thing about hidden pain is how it grows restless in the dark. Ignore it long enough, and it begins to press outward. Elias felt that pressure now more than ever. Whenever he rushed through his days, the heaviness seemed to follow more closely. Whenever he forced a smile while feeling something else entirely, the stone inside felt heavier. It was as if pushing the feeling away only made it sink deeper, and yet it never disappeared. Standing beside the basin, he picked up a smaller pebble from the ground. He tossed it lightly into the water and watched the ripples widen in quiet circles. One small movement had stirred the entire surface. For a moment he wondered if emotions worked the same way. Perhaps what he ignored kept echoing beneath the surface of his life. He crouched slightly, studying the dark stone again. It didn't look threatening at all, just smooth, worn by time, quietly present. Yet in his mind it began to resemble every emotion he had tried to bury. Not loud, just persistent. A breeze stirred the leaves overhead, sending a faint ripple across the basin. The water moved, the reflections shifted, but the stone remained where it was. And Elias felt an odd discomfort rise in his chest, because the truth was becoming harder to avoid. The stone wasn't causing the disturbance. The resistance around it was. He sighed softly and rubbed his palms together. Maybe the real trouble wasn't that the stone existed. Maybe the trouble came from pretending it shouldn't be there at all. Still, even with that thought forming, Elias wasn't sure what to do next. Fortunately, someone nearby had been quietly watching his curiosity unfold. Elias had just straightened up from the basin when a quiet voice drifted from the nearby bench. "Interesting stone, isn't it?" the man said gently. Elias turned, a little startled, and noticed an older man sitting there with an easy posture. Gray hair, calm eyes, the sort of presence that didn't seem rushed by anything. He had likely been there the whole time. "Yes, I suppose it is," Elias replied, unsure what else to say. The man smiled softly, not the kind of smile that expects conversation. Just a quiet acknowledgement, as if they were both simply sharing the same moment. For a while, neither of them spoke, and oddly enough, the silence didn't feel uncomfortable. The old man gestured toward the basin. "Most people don't stop long enough to notice it," he said. "They pass by quickly, like they're afraid the stone might ask them a question." Elias chuckled lightly at that. The thought felt strangely accurate. "What kind of question?" Elias asked after a pause. The man leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on his knees. "Oh, nothing complicated," he said calmly. "Just the sort that asks whether we're willing to sit beside what feels heavy." He glanced at the stone again, almost fondly. Elias shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "That sounds easier said than done," he admitted. The man nodded slowly, as if he had expected that answer. "Yes, most people think sitting with pain will make it grow." Then he shrugged gently. "But running from it tends to feed it far more." For a moment the two of them simply watched the water. A breeze passed through the trees, stirring the surface into soft ripples. The stone remained exactly where it had been all along. The old man didn't offer advice or explanations. He just sat there, comfortably present. Elias noticed something curious. The man didn't seem interested in fixing anything. He didn't ask what was wrong or offer solutions. Instead, his calm presence made the moment feel wider somehow, as if there was room for whatever Elias happened to be carrying. After a while, the man spoke again, almost casually. "You know," he said, nodding toward the basin, "stones become smoother when water moves around them freely." He paused, letting the thought hang gently in the air. Pressure fades when nothing is trying to push it away. Elias frowned slightly, considering the idea. Part of him resisted it immediately, but another part, the quieter part, felt a small sense of relief just hearing it, as if something inside him had been waiting for permission to stop running, and the old man seemed to know exactly where that path might begin. The old man leaned back slightly on the bench, letting the quiet settle again. For a moment, the only sound was the wind brushing gently through the leaves. Elias kept his eyes on the basin. watching the small ripples fade into stillness. It felt strange how calm the water became once nothing disturbed it. The man seemed to notice that Elias had begun to observe more carefully. "You see that stone?" the mentor said softly, nodding toward the basin. "It hasn't fought the water for a single moment." He picked up a small twig and gently stirred the surface. Ripples spread outward, dancing around the stone. "And yet the water moves. It always moves." Elias crossed his arms loosely, curiosity beginning to replace his hesitation. "So you're saying the stone is like pain?" he asked. The old man smiled faintly, as if Elias had just taken an important step. "Not exactly," he replied. "The pain is the water moving through your life." The mentor reached down and lightly touched the rim of the basin. "What makes suffering heavier is the hand that keeps pushing the water away." He made a slow sweeping motion across the surface, creating another ripple. "When we resist the feeling, we trap it. When we allow it, it begins to move again." Elias watched the circles widen across the basin. They appeared strong at first, then gradually softened and disappeared. Nothing dramatic, just a natural settling back into quiet. And somehow that simple movement felt like a small demonstration. "Try something," the old man said gently. "Nothing complicated." He closed his eyes for a moment and breathed in slowly through his nose. Then he exhaled, long and steady. "Just sit with whatever you feel, for one breath." Elias hesitated, then awkwardly mirrored the motion. He inhaled, noticing the familiar tightness in his chest. Normally he would push that sensation away immediately, but this time he simply observed it, curious, almost like watching the ripples in the basin. To his surprise, the tightness didn't grow stronger. If anything, it shifted slightly, like a knot loosening half a turn. Nothing miraculous, just a subtle softening he hadn't expected. The old man noticed the change in Elias's expression. "You see," the mentor said quietly, "when you stop wrestling with the water, it remembers how to flow." He glanced again at the stone resting peacefully in the basin. The stone remains, but the storm around it slowly passes. Elias felt something inside him lean toward that possibility. The days that followed didn't change Elias's life all at once. There was no sudden moment where everything became light and effortless. In fact, the first few attempts felt a little awkward. Sitting quietly with a feeling he had spent years avoiding wasn't exactly comfortable. Still, something about the mentor's calm words kept echoing in his mind. One morning, while waiting for his coffee, Elias felt a familiar sting. A coworker had dismissed one of his ideas the day before. Normally, he would replay the conversation endlessly, tightening with frustration. But this time he remembered the basin and the steady stone. So he paused and took one slow breath. The feeling didn't vanish immediately. It rose in his chest like a small ripple of heat. Yet instead of pushing it away, he simply noticed it. "Oh, there you are," he murmured quietly to himself. And strangely, the ripple softened. Later that week, another moment arrived. A message from an old friend went unanswered, stirring that quiet ache of rejection. Elias felt the urge to distract himself, to scroll through his phone until the feeling disappeared. But he caught the impulse just in time. Instead, he rested his hand over his chest and breathed slowly, once, twice. He imagined the stone again, resting calmly in the basin. The water around it moved gently, never forced, never trapped. For the first time, Elias allowed his sadness to simply exist, not as an enemy, just as water passing through. Something unexpected happened then. The emotion, once sharp and tight, began to loosen slightly. Not gone, but no longer overwhelming. Like a wave that had already broken and was quietly returning to the sea. Elias blinked, almost surprised. That evening he returned to the path by the trees. The mentor sat in his usual spot, watching the breeze skim across the water. Elias didn't say much. He simply sat beside him for a while, the two of them sharing the silence like old companions. And for once, silence didn't feel dangerous. "Water moves easier when nothing blocks it," the old man said eventually. Elias nodded slowly, eyes still on the basin. The stone looked the same as always, but somehow, it didn't seem nearly as heavy, and Elias was beginning to understand why. Of course, life wasn't finished offering its difficult moments. Painful memories, sharp words, lonely evenings, they still appeared from time to time, but something inside Elias had shifted just enough to notice them differently. And before long, an unexpected moment would test what he was learning. A few days later, the lesson Elias had been practicing quietly met the real world again. It happened during an ordinary afternoon at work. A colleague, tired and impatient, spoke sharply to him in front of others. The words weren't brutal, but they carried that familiar sting, the kind that used to echo in his mind for hours. For a split second, Elias felt the old reaction rising. His chest tightened, his thoughts sharpened, ready to defend, explain, or withdraw. Normally, the moment would have unfolded quickly. An irritated reply, a silent grudge, a restless evening afterward. But this time, something different slipped into the space between feeling and reaction. A pause, small but noticeable. In that pause, Elias remembered the basin. He imagined the smooth, dark stone resting quietly under the water. The feeling in his chest was just another ripple passing through. Not something to fight, not something to hide, just movement. So he did something subtle, barely visible to anyone else in the room. He inhaled slowly through his nose and let the breath settle deep in his lungs. Then he exhaled, steady and quiet, as if letting the water move around the stone. The tension softened by a small degree. Instead of reacting sharply, Elias simply nodded and continued the conversation calmly. No dramatic transformation, no grand speech, just presence. And somehow the moment lost its weight almost immediately, like a wave that had nowhere to crash. Later that evening, he walked again past the quiet path with the basin. The mentor was there, as usual, watching the water reflect the fading sunlight. Elias sat beside him and shared the story with a soft smile. The old man listened without interruption. Then he chuckled gently. "You didn't remove the stone," the mentor said. "You allowed the water to move." Elias looked at the basin again, noticing how naturally the ripples came and went. No struggle, just quiet flow. That night, Elias carried the lesson home with him. He realized that pain would still visit from time to time, through memories, criticism, loneliness, disappointment, but he no longer felt the same urgency to escape it. Because now he had begun to see something deeper. Presence itself could transform the experience. And somewhere beyond that quiet realization, another simple discovery was waiting. A small practice so gentle that anyone could try it. Something that required no special place, no perfect moment, just a breath, and the courage to notice what was already there. Not long after that evening, the mentor invited Elias to try something even simpler. They were sitting beside the basin again, the late afternoon light resting softly on the water. The stone remained where it had always been, calm and unmoved. The old man pointed toward it with a quiet smile. "Most lessons," he said, "are easier than people expect." Elias tilted his head slightly. "Easier?" he asked. The mentor nodded and folded his hands together loosely. "Yes, because the heart already knows how to feel. The difficulty," he added gently, "is allowing the feeling to stay for a moment." He leaned forward and traced a small circle in the water with his finger. "Try this whenever something heavy appears," he said. "Not tomorrow, not later, right when the feeling arrives." He paused for a moment, letting the thought settle. Just one quiet minute. "First," the mentor continued, "notice where the feeling sits in your body. Maybe your chest feels tight. Maybe your stomach feels heavy. Don't analyze it too much. Just notice it, the way you'd notice this stone in the water. Simple awareness is enough. Then take one slow breath," he said softly, "in through your nose and out through your mouth. While you breathe, imagine the feeling like water moving around the stone. You don't need to remove it. You're only giving it space to flow." Elias practiced the exercise right there on the bench. He closed his eyes briefly and noticed a faint pressure in his chest. Normally he would label it, judge it, push it aside. Instead, he breathed slowly and simply let the sensation exist. The moment felt surprisingly gentle. When he opened his eyes, the basin looked exactly the same as before. The stone hadn't changed at all, but Elias's shoulders had lowered slightly, almost without his noticing. The old man watched with quiet approval. "See?" he said, smiling. "Pain rarely asks for solutions first," the mentor added calmly. "It asks for presence. When we give it that small moment of attention, it begins to soften on its own. And that's when something deeper quietly appears." Elias gazed again at the stone resting beneath the water. For years he had believed peace meant eliminating pain completely. Now he was beginning to sense another possibility. Perhaps peace wasn't the absence of the stone at all. Perhaps it was the calm that appears when we stop fighting the water. Autumn arrived quietly in the weeks that followed. The trees along the path turned shades of gold and amber, and the air carried a softer chill. Elias still visited the basin from time to time, though not always for the same reason. At first he had come searching for answers. Now he mostly came to remember something simple. One evening he sat alone on the familiar bench. The mentor had not arrived yet, but the quiet felt comfortable all the same. The stone rested in the basin just as it always had. Water gathered around it, moving gently with the breeze. Nothing about the scene had changed, and yet everything had. Elias realized something he once believed impossible. The stone had never truly been his enemy. Grief, disappointment, lonely memories, they were simply parts of the water moving through his life. The suffering had come from the endless effort to hold it back, from the exhausting belief that pain should never exist. Now, when difficult moments appeared, he didn't greet them with panic. He paused. One breath, sometimes two, just enough space for the water to move instead of crash. And that small pause changed everything. A sharp word from someone no longer lingered for hours. A painful memory could rise and pass without tightening his whole body. Even quiet loneliness on certain evenings felt different somehow. Not pleasant, perhaps, but no longer unbearable. Just another ripple moving across the surface. He understood now what the mentor had shown him without ever forcing the lesson. Peace was never hiding somewhere far beyond pain. It had always been waiting in the moment he stopped resisting it, in the breath where acceptance quietly replaced struggle, in the stillness that follows when the storm moves through. A breeze brushed across the basin, sending gentle circles across the water. Elias watched them expand slowly until they disappeared into calm. The stone remained exactly where it had been all along, yet the surface around it looked peaceful, almost luminous, and he smiled softly at the simplicity of it. Somewhere behind him, footsteps approached along the path, the mentor's familiar presence returning without urgency. Elias didn't turn right away. He kept watching the water for another moment, because the quiet truth had finally become clear. Peace was never found by escaping the storm. It appeared when someone learned to stand calmly in the rain, and in that calm the storm always remembered how to pass, just like water flowing gently around a patient stone, and just like a heart that had finally stopped running.